The gunshot echoed through the canyon, and Grace Jameson knew without looking that another bounty hunter had just met his end somewhere in the dusty streets of Dallas, Texas, and she clutched the wriggling lamb tighter against her chest as she pressed herself into the shadows of the mercantile storefront, praying the violence would pass her by like it had done for the past 3 weeks since she had arrived in this God-forsaken town in the summer of 1878. The lamb bleated softly, and Grace shushed it with trembling fingers, stroking its woolly head as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had named the creature Buttercup after finding it abandoned on the trail leading into town, its mother nowhere to be seen, likely taken by coyotes or worse. The little thing had been half-starved, and Grace could not bear to leave it behind. Now, 3 weeks later, Buttercup followed her everywhere like a devoted puppy, and despite the hardship of her circumstances, the lamb brought her moments of unexpected joy. The shooting stopped, and Grace cautiously peered around the corner. The street had cleared except for a tall figure standing in the center of the dusty road, a smoking revolver still in his hand. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in Dallas knew Gabriel Jackson, the solemn cowboy who worked the Morrison Ranch on the outskirts of town. He never smiled, never laughed, and barely spoke more than 3 words to anyone. The townspeople whispered about him, saying he had lost someone dear, though no one knew the full story. Gabriel holstered his weapon with practiced ease and began walking toward the saloon, his long coat swaying with each step. His face was hard as granite, his jaw set in that perpetual expression of grim determination that seemed carved into his features. Grace had seen him perhaps a dozen times since arriving in Dallas, and not once had she witnessed any emotion cross his weathered face. Buttercup wriggled free from her arms and bounded into the street before Grace could stop her. The lamb had a habit of escaping at the worst possible moments, and this was no exception. "Buttercup, no," Grace called out, gathering her skirts and rushing after the animal. The lamb trotted directly toward Gabriel, bleating happily as if the tall, intimidating man were an old friend. Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she chased after her wayward pet. Gabriel stopped walking and looked down at the lamb now circling his boots with enthusiastic curiosity. "I am so sorry," Grace said breathlessly as she reached them. "She gets away from me sometimes." "She does not mean any harm." Gabriel stared at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Up close, she could see the fine lines etched around them, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the weariness that seemed to emanate from him like heat from sun-baked earth. He was perhaps 30 years old, though the hardness in his expression made him seem older. "Madam," he said simply, tipping his hat slightly, Buttercup, apparently deciding that Gabriel was not paying her enough attention, did something Grace had never seen her do before. The lamb reared up on her hind legs and performed a little spinning hop, landing with a graceless thud before immediately repeating the trick. It looked absurdly like a dance, and Grace felt a laugh bubble up in her throat despite her nervousness. "I have no idea where she learned that," Grace said, scooping up the lamb. "She started doing it last week. I think she might believe she is a circus performer." Gabriel's expression did not change. He simply nodded once and moved to walk around her. "Thank you," Grace called after him, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Perhaps for not being angry about the interruption, or for not shooting her lamb, or simply for acknowledging her existence in this town where she felt invisible most days. He did not respond, just continued his steady march toward the saloon. Grace returned to the small boarding house where she rented a cramped room on the 2nd floor. The landlady, Mrs. Henderson, had reluctantly agreed to let her keep Buttercup as long as the animal stayed quiet and did not damage anything. So far, The lamb had been a model tenant, though Grace suspected that could change at any moment given Buttercup's increasingly mischievous nature. She fed the lamb from a bottle she had fashioned from a glass container and a leather glove, watching as Buttercup gulped down the milk with enthusiastic slurps. The sight never failed to warm her heart. Grace had come to Dallas seeking work after her father died of fever back in Missouri. She had no other family, no prospects, and very little money. The journey had been long and frightening, and more than once she had questioned her decision to head west alone. But what choice did she have? Staying in Missouri meant becoming dependent on the charity of neighbors who had little enough themselves. At least in Dallas, she had heard there might be opportunities for a woman willing to work hard. So far, those opportunities had proven scarce. She had found occasional employment washing laundry or helping in the general store, but nothing permanent, nothing that would allow her to save enough to secure her future. Buttercup finished her milk and settled down on the blanket Grace had laid out for her, closing her eyes contentedly. Grace sat on the edge of her narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of discouragement. She was down to her last few dollars, and if she did not find steady work soon, she would have no choice but to sell Buttercup to the butcher. The thought made her throat tighten with grief. "We will figure something out," she whispered to the sleeping lamb. "I promise." The next morning dawned hot and bright, the Texas sun already beating down mercilessly by the time Grace emerged from the boarding house with Buttercup trotting at her heels. She had heard that the Morrison ranch might need help with domestic duties, and though the idea of approaching the ranch intimidated her, desperation left little room for timidity. The walk to the Morrison ranch took nearly an hour, and by the time Grace arrived, her dress was soaked with perspiration, and Buttercup was panting heavily. The ranch was larger than she had expected, with a sprawling main house, several barns, and extensive corrals where horses milled about in the morning heat. A middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes approached her from the direction of the nearest barn. "Help you, miss?" "I am looking for work," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I heard the ranch might need someone for domestic duties. I can cook, clean, mend clothing, and I am willing to learn whatever else might be needed." The man studied her for a moment, then glanced down at Buttercup. "That is an unusual companion." "She is very well behaved," Grace said quickly. "She would not be any trouble." "I am Henry Morrison," the man said, extending his hand. "I own this ranch. My wife passed 2 years ago, and I have been managing without help in the house since then. Truth is, the place is falling apart. If you are serious about the work, I could use someone." Relief flooded through Grace so intensely she felt dizzy. "I am very serious, Mr. Morrison. I promise you will not regret hiring me. Call me Henry. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board in the small cottage behind the main house. It is nothing fancy, but it is clean and private. You can start today if you are willing." "Yes," Grace said immediately. "Yes, thank you so much." Henry smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Come on then. I will show you the cottage first, let you get settled. We eat dinner at sunset, and I will introduce you to the ranch hands then." The cottage was indeed small, consisting of just 2 rooms. A main living area with a simple kitchen and a bedroom barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand it contained. But after weeks in the cramped boarding house room, it felt like a palace. There was even a small fenced yard where Buttercup could graze safely. Grace spent the rest of the morning exploring the main house and taking stock of what needed to be done. Henry had not exaggerated when he said the place was falling apart. Dust covered every surface, dishes were piled in the kitchen, and the curtains hung in tatters. But Grace felt no discouragement looking at the work ahead. Instead, she felt energized. This was purpose. This was opportunity. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By evening, she had made a noticeable difference in the kitchen and main living areas. The dishes were washed and put away, the floors swept, and the windows cleaned until they sparkled in the fading sunlight. Her back ached and her hands were raw, but she felt a satisfaction she had not experienced in months. Henry appeared in the doorway as the sun began to set, his eyes widening as he took in the transformation. "Grace, this is remarkable. I had forgotten the house could look this way." "There is still much to do," Grace said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "But I will get there." "Come on," Henry said. "Time to meet the men. Fair warning, they are not much for social graces, but they are good workers and decent folks." Grace followed him to the bunkhouse, where 5 ranch hands were gathered around a table for the evening meal. They looked up as she entered, and she felt their curious gazes sweep over her. "Men, this is Grace Thompson. She will be managing the house from now on." "I expect you all to treat her with respect," Henry said firmly. The men murmured their greetings, and Grace offered a nervous smile. Then she saw him. Gabriel Jackson sat at the far end of the table, his expression as solemn and unreadable as ever. Their eyes met briefly, and she thought she detected the faintest flicker of recognition before he returned his attention to his plate. "Gabriel, you remember Miss Thompson from town," Henry said. "Madam," Gabriel said without looking up. The meal passed in relative quiet, the men eating with the single-minded focus of those who worked hard physical labor all day. Grace helped Henry serve the food, and she noticed how Gabriel ate mechanically, as if the act were simply another chore to complete rather than something to be enjoyed. After dinner, as the men filed out, Grace caught Gabriel's arm without thinking. He stopped, looking down at her hand on his sleeve with an expression that might have been surprise. "I wanted to thank you properly," Grace said. "For yesterday, in town, I know Buttercup was a nuisance." "She was not," Gabriel said. His voice was deep and rough like gravel underfoot. "Well, still, thank you for being kind about it." Gabriel nodded once and gently pulled his arm free, heading out into the darkness without another word. "Do not take it personally," Henry said from behind her. "Gabriel has worked for me for 5 years now. Best ranch hand I have ever had. But he keeps to himself. Lost his wife and infant daughter to cholera 7 years back. Has not been the same since, from what I understand." Grace felt her heart constrict with sympathy. No wonder he seemed carved from stone. That kind of loss would break anyone. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Grace rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent her days cleaning, mending, and slowly bringing the Morrison house back to life. In the evenings, she cooked dinner and often sat with Henry on the porch afterward, listening to his stories about the ranch and the changing times. Buttercup thrived in her new environment, growing plumper and more mischievous by the day. The lamb had discovered that she could escape her small yard by squeezing through a gap in the fence, and she took every opportunity to do so, usually appearing at the most inconvenient moments. One afternoon, Grace was hanging laundry when she heard men shouting from the direction of the corrals. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward the commotion, her heart pounding. Had someone been hurt, she arrived to find several ranch hands trying to catch their horses, which were spooked and running in agitated circles. And in the center of the corral, looking extremely pleased with herself, was Buttercup, performing her spinning hop dance. "Oh no," Grace breathed. She climbed the fence and dropped into the corral, calling for Buttercup. The lamb ignored her completely, too delighted with the chaos she had caused. Gabriel appeared on horseback, rope in hand. He moved with fluid grace, separating the horses from the lamb with subtle movements that showed years of experience. Within minutes, he had calmed the horses and maneuvered Buttercup into a corner where Grace could grab her. "I am so sorry," Grace said, clutching the wriggling lamb. She got out again. "I will fix the fence better this time, I promise." Gabriel dismounted and approached them. He reached out and scratched Buttercup behind the ears, and the lamb immediately calmed, gazing up at him with adoring eyes. "She likes you," Grace observed. "She is trouble," Gabriel said, but Grace thought she detected the faintest hint of warmth in his voice. "She is," Grace agreed, "but she is also the best thing that has happened to me in a long time." Gabriel looked at her then, really looked at her, and for just a moment his hard expression softened. "I understand that." Before Grace could respond, Buttercup twisted in her arms and licked Gabriel's hand with her rough tongue. Then, as if to show off, the lamb did her spinning hop again, this time with even more dramatic flair than usual. And Gabriel Jackson, the solemn cowboy who never smiled, did something remarkable. The corner of his mouth twitched, just the tiniest movement, barely noticeable, but Grace saw it. It was not quite a smile, but it was closer than she had ever seen him come. "Did you teach her that?" Gabriel asked. "No," Grace said, laughing. "She invented it herself. I think she was a performer in another life." The almost smile appeared again, slightly more pronounced this time. Gabriel shook his head slowly, as if bemused by the entire situation. "Never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Grace admitted. "She does it whenever she wants attention or is particularly happy. Sometimes I think she does it just to make me laugh. Does it work?" "Every time." Gabriel patted Buttercup once more, then mounted his horse. "You should fix that fence," he said, but his tone lacked any real criticism. "I will," Grace promised, watching as he rode back toward the other hands. That evening, as Grace prepared dinner, she found herself thinking about that almost smile. It had been such a small thing, barely there at all, but it felt significant somehow. Like a crack appearing in a dam, the first sign that something long held back might eventually break free. Over the following weeks, Buttercup continued her pattern of escapes and chaos. She got into the chicken coop and sent the hens into a panic. She wandered into the barn and chewed on a saddle blanket. She discovered that if she bleated loudly enough outside the bunkhouse, one of the ranch hands would usually come out and give her attention. But increasingly, when Buttercup escaped, it was Gabriel who found her. Or perhaps, Grace began to suspect, Buttercup was seeking him out deliberately. The lamb seemed to have developed a particular fondness for the solemn cowboy, and Gabriel, despite his gruff demeanor, never seemed truly annoyed by the interruptions. One evening, Grace went looking for Buttercup after the lamb disappeared from her yard yet again. She found them behind the barn, Gabriel sitting on an overturned bucket, Buttercup lying contentedly at his feet while he cleaned tack. He was talking to the lamb in a low voice, too quiet for Grace to make out the words. She started to approach, then hesitated. There was something private about the moment, something she felt she should not intrude upon. But then Buttercup spotted her and bounded over with her usual enthusiasm, and Gabriel looked up. "She found you again," Grace said, coming closer. "Seems to happen a lot," Gabriel replied. He returned his attention to the bridle he was working on, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Grace sat down on a nearby bale of hay, and Buttercup settled between them, apparently content to have both of her favorite people present. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft evening breeze rustling through the barn. "Henry told me about your wife and daughter," Grace said quietly. "I am sorry for your loss." Gabriel's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. "Long time ago now. Does it get easier?" "No," Gabriel said simply. "You just get used to carrying it. Grace thought about her own father, about the grief that still ambushed her at unexpected moments. "I lost my father this past spring. Fever took him. I know it is not the same as losing a wife and child, but I understand something about that weight." Gabriel set down the bridle and looked at her. In the fading light, his eyes seemed less hard, more human. "Your father, he was good to you. He was everything to me," Grace said. "After my mother died giving birth to my brother, who also did not survive, it was just the two of us. He made sure I could read and write, taught me to think for myself, treated me like I had value even though I was just a girl. When he died, I felt like I had lost the only person in the world who truly saw me." "He would be proud of you," Gabriel said. "Coming all this way alone, making a life for yourself, that takes courage." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness in his words. "Thank you." Buttercup, sensing the emotional shift, stood up and did her spinning hop, then bleated loudly as if to say she was still the most important thing present. Both Grace and Gabriel looked at the lamb, and this time Gabriel did smile. It was small and brief, but unmistakable. Grace felt her breath catch. The smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing the man he might have been before grief carved him into stone. "She really is a performer," Gabriel said, and there was definite warmth in his voice now. "She knows how to work a crowd," Grace agreed, feeling her own smile widen. Buttercup, encouraged by the positive response, did the spinning hop again, this time adding a little kick at the end that sent her tumbling sideways. She scrambled back to her feet and shook herself, looking mildly offended, and Gabriel actually laughed. It was a rusty sound, as if the mechanism for laughter had not been used in so long it had nearly forgotten how to work, but it was genuine. Grace found herself laughing too, not just at Buttercup, but at the sheer joy of hearing Gabriel laugh. It felt like witnessing something miraculous, like watching flowers bloom in the desert. "I should get her back to the cottage," Grace said reluctantly. "And you probably have work to finish." "Probably," Gabriel agreed, but he made no move to return to the bridle. Instead, he stood and walked over to Buttercup, crouching down to rub the lamb's woolly head. "You are a strange little creature," he told her, "but you are growing on me." Buttercup nuzzled his hand affectionately, and Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest. After that evening, things shifted between them in small but noticeable ways. Gabriel began appearing at the main house more often, ostensibly to speak with Henry about ranch business, but usually managing to spend a few minutes talking with Grace as well. Their conversations were still brief, but they grew easier, less weighted by the heavy silence that had initially defined him. He helped her fix Buttercup's fence, building it higher and stronger so the lamb could not escape as easily. He brought her wildflowers once, claiming he had found them while checking the property line and thought she might like them for the table. He started lingering after meals, helping clear dishes despite her protests that it was not necessary, and he smiled more. Not often and never easily, but Grace began to recognize the signs, the slight softening around his eyes, the barely perceptible curve of his lips. Buttercup remained his favorite source of amusement. The lamb seemed to sense when Gabriel was nearby and would inevitably perform her tricks, adding new variations that never failed to catch him off guard. Grace found herself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that both excited and frightened her. She had not come to Texas looking for romance. After losing her father, the idea of opening her heart to someone else, of risking that kind of loss again, had seemed impossible. But Gabriel was different. He understood grief. He knew what it meant to carry that weight. And somehow, despite or perhaps because of that shared understanding, being around him made her feel less alone. One Sunday, Henry gave everyone the afternoon off, and Grace decided to take Buttercup for a walk beyond the ranch boundaries. The lamb needed exercise, and Grace needed to clear her head. She had been having confusing dreams about Gabriel, dreams where he smiled at her and held her hand and said things that made her heart race, and she needed space to think. She walked for perhaps an hour, Buttercup trotting happily beside her, occasionally stopping to nibble at particularly interesting bits of vegetation. They had just reached a small creek when Grace heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned to see Gabriel approaching on his horse, a large bay gelding with a white star on its forehead. "Mind some company?" he called out. "Not at all," Grace said, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at his presence. Gabriel dismounted and let his horse drink from the creek. Buttercup immediately trotted over to investigate the much larger animal, showing no fear whatsoever. The horse lowered his head and sniffed the lamb curiously, then snorted, sending Buttercup skittering backward before returning for another inspection. "She has no sense of self-preservation," Grace said. "Reminds me of someone," Gabriel replied, and there was a teasing note in his voice that Grace had never heard before. "Are you implying that I lack self-preservation? You traveled halfway across the country alone with barely any money and no prospects. You took in a stray lamb you could not afford to feed. You walked into a town in the middle of a gunfight. So yes, I might be implying that." Grace felt indignation and amusement war within her. "Well, when you put it that way, I suppose I do sound rather reckless." "Not reckless," Gabriel said, his expression growing serious. "Brave. There is a difference." "Is there?" "Sometimes I think bravery is just another word for not having better options." Gabriel moved closer, and Grace felt the air between them grow charged with something she could not quite name. "Plenty of people have no options and still choose to give up," he said. "You did not. That is brave." Grace looked up at him, at this man who had been so closed off just weeks ago, and who now stood before her offering words she had not known she needed to hear. "You are brave too," she said softly. "Still being here, still working, still living after everything you lost. That is the hardest kind of brave." Something flickered in Gabriel's eyes, something raw and vulnerable. For a moment, Grace thought he might step closer, might reach for her, but then Buttercup bleated loudly and launched into her most elaborate performance yet, spinning and hopping and kicking her legs in a display that was equal parts graceful and absurd. The moment broke, and both of them laughed, the tension dissipating into something lighter but no less significant. "She has impeccable timing," Gabriel said dryly. "She always has," Grace agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking about everything and nothing. Gabriel told her about growing up in Tennessee, about coming west after the war, about the years before he met his wife. Grace talked about Missouri, about her father's dreams of seeing the ocean someday, about the books she loved to read whenever she could get her hands on them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Gabriel helped her back onto her feet. His hand lingered in hers for just a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in a touch so gentle it made her breath catch. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know something. When my wife and daughter died, I thought I died too, not my body but everything that mattered. I have been walking around for 7 years like a ghost, just going through the motions. And then you showed up with that ridiculous lamb and something started to wake up inside me. It scared me. It still scares me." "Gabriel," Grace whispered, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I am not good at this," he continued. "I do not know how to do this again, how to let someone in, but I want to try. If you are willing to be patient with me, I want to try." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I am scared too," she admitted. I am terrified of losing someone else I care about, but I care about you, Gabriel. I care about you so much it keeps me awake at night." Gabriel reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Then maybe we can be scared together." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and kissed her. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a declaration, and Grace answered by rising up on her toes and kissing him back. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and for the first time since her father died, Grace felt truly safe. Buttercup, apparently feeling neglected, butted her head against their legs and bleated insistently. They broke apart, laughing, and Gabriel scooped up the lamb, tucking her under one arm while keeping his other arm around Grace. "I suppose we should head back," Grace said, though she made no move to step away from him. "I suppose so," Gabriel agreed, equally reluctant. They walked back to the ranch together, Gabriel leading his horse with one hand while keeping his arm around Grace's shoulders, Buttercup trotting contentedly beside them. By the time they arrived, full darkness had fallen, and lanterns glowed in the windows of the main house and bunkhouse. At the door to Grace's cottage, Gabriel set Buttercup down and took both of Grace's hands in his. "Can I call on you properly? Take you into town, maybe? Henry is having a social at the ranch next month. Would you accompany me to that?" "Yes," Grace said immediately. "Yes to all of it." Gabriel smiled, that beautiful transformative smile that made him look years younger. He kissed her once more softly, then reluctantly let her go. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Gabriel." The following weeks passed in a haze of happiness Grace had not known was possible. Gabriel courted her with old-fashioned earnestness, bringing her small gifts, taking her on walks, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings while Buttercup performed for them, and the stars wheeled overhead. He told her more about his past, about the wife he had loved and lost, and Grace listened without jealousy. That love had shaped him, made him who he was, and she would not wish it away even if she could. She told him about her fears for the future, about her dreams of maybe one day having a small farm of her own, and he listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering suggestions. Henry watched their growing relationship with obvious approval. "You are good for him," he told Grace one morning while she was kneading bread. "I have not seen Gabriel this alive in all the years he has worked for me." "He is good for me too," Grace said, feeling her cheeks warm. The night of Henry's social arrived, and Grace wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to her mother. She had mended it carefully and added new lace at the collar, and when Gabriel saw her, his eyes widened with appreciation. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Grace replied, taking in his freshly pressed shirt and carefully combed hair. The party was held in the largest barn, which had been swept clean and decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. Neighbors from surrounding ranches attended, and there was music and dancing and more food than Grace had seen in months. She met ranchers and their wives, other cowboys, merchants from town, and everyone seemed to know and respect Gabriel. When the dancing started, Gabriel led her onto the floor with surprising grace. "I did not know you could dance," Grace said, following his lead. "There are a lot of things you do not know about me yet," Gabriel replied, spinning her gently, "but I plan to tell you all of them if you will let me." "I will let you," Grace promised. They danced until Grace's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. Between dances, they stood together at the edge of the barn, Gabriel's arm around her waist, and watched the other couples swirl past. Grace felt a contentment she had not experienced since before her father's death, a sense of belonging that went deeper than just finding employment or shelter. Buttercup, who had been safely secured in Grace's cottage for the evening, somehow managed to escape and appeared at the barn entrance in the middle of a particularly lively reel. She surveyed the scene for a moment, then trotted directly onto the dance floor and began performing her spinning hop routine, apparently deciding that this many people needed to witness her talents. The dancing came to a confused halt as couples tried to avoid the enthusiastic lamb. Grace rushed forward to catch Buttercup, her face burning with embarrassment, but before she could reach the lamb, the musicians struck up a new tune, and Buttercup seemed to dance along, her hops perfectly timed to the music. The crowd began to laugh and clap, encouraging the lamb, and Grace stopped trying to catch her, instead watching in amazement as Buttercup performed like a seasoned entertainer. Gabriel came up beside Grace, shaking his head in disbelief. "She is going to be the talk of the county," he said. "I am so sorry," Grace said, fighting back laughter. "I have no idea how she got out." "Do not apologize," Gabriel said, pulling her close. "This is perfect. This is exactly who you two are, and I would not change it for anything." Eventually, Grace did catch Buttercup, but not before the lamb had won the hearts of everyone present. For the rest of the evening, people kept coming up to ask about the performing lamb, and Grace found herself telling the story of how she had found Buttercup over and over again. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Gabriel walked Grace back to her cottage, Buttercup tucked sleepily under his arm. At her door, he set the lamb down and took Grace's hands. "I love you," he said simply. "I did not think I would ever say those words again, but I love you, Grace. You and your ridiculous lamb have given me a reason to feel again, to hope again." Grace felt tears well up, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she said. "I love you so much, Gabriel." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Gabriel said. "I know it is fast, and I know we have not been courting long, but I do not want to waste any more time. I have wasted 7 years already. Marry me, Grace." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Henry standing as witness and all the ranch hands in attendance. Grace wore a new dress that Henry's sister had helped her make, white cotton with blue trim, and Gabriel wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. Buttercup, of course, attended the ceremony and managed to steal a significant portion of it by performing her tricks whenever there was a pause in the proceedings. The circuit preacher who performed the service seemed more amused than annoyed, and he declared it the most entertaining wedding he had ever conducted. After the ceremony, there was a feast and more dancing, and as the sun set on their wedding day, Gabriel and Grace stood together watching the sky turn colors, Buttercup lying contentedly at their feet. "Are you happy?" Gabriel asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Grace replied. "Are you?" "Yes," Gabriel said, and she heard the wonder in his voice. "I did not think I could be again, but yes, I am happy." They moved into a small house on the Morrison property that Henry helped them purchase, a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living area. It was not much, but it was theirs, and Grace threw herself into making it a home. She hung curtains, planted a garden, and even built a proper shelter for Buttercup, who was growing larger by the month. Gabriel proved to be a devoted husband, attentive and affectionate in ways that constantly surprised Grace. He would leave her small notes hidden around the house for her to find, little declarations of love scrawled in his rough handwriting. He brought her breakfast in bed on Sunday mornings. He held her when she had nightmares about losing her father and never once made her feel weak for her grief. In turn, Grace learned the rhythms of his sorrow, the days when the weight of his past losses pressed down heavier than usual. She learned to simply be present during those times, to offer comfort without trying to fix what could not be fixed. And slowly, gradually, those hard days became less frequent. 8 months after their wedding, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Gabriel one evening while they sat on their porch, Buttercup grazing nearby in the fading light. "Are you sure?" Gabriel asked, his face cycling through shock, joy, and terror in rapid succession. "I am sure," Grace said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" Gabriel's eyes filled with tears. "I am terrified," he admitted. "After losing my daughter, I am absolutely terrified. But yes, I am happy." "So happy, Grace." They held each other as the sun set, both crying, both scared, both hopeful. The pregnancy was difficult. Grace suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and Gabriel hovered over her constantly, worried by every moment of discomfort. As her belly grew, his anxiety increased, and Grace had to gently remind him that she needed him to be calm, to be strong for her. "I am sorry," Gabriel said one night after she chided him for the third time that day for trying to stop her from doing basic chores. "I just cannot lose you. I cannot lose another child. I would not survive it, Grace." "You will not lose us," Grace said firmly, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. "But you need to trust that I know my own body, and you need to let me live my life. I cannot spend 9 months being treated like I am made of glass." Gabriel nodded, taking a deep breath. "You are right. I will try to do better." And he did try, though Grace could see it was a constant battle for him. She appreciated his concern even when it frustrated her, understanding that it came from a place of profound love and fear. Buttercup seemed to sense something significant was happening, and became even more protective of Grace than Gabriel was. The lamb, now fully grown and quite large, stayed close whenever Grace was outside and would position herself between Grace and anyone who approached. She had become something of a local celebrity, and people from town would sometimes ride out to the ranch just to see the performing lamb. Grace's labor began on a cool October evening in 1879. Gabriel immediately panicked, despite all his promises to stay calm, and had to be firmly directed by the midwife Henry had hired weeks earlier in preparation. "You need to leave," the midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, told Gabriel as Grace's contractions intensified. "You are making your wife more anxious." "I am not leaving her," Gabriel said stubbornly. "Gabriel," Grace gasped between contractions. "Please, go wait with Henry. I will be fine." Reluctantly, Gabriel left, and Grace could hear him pacing on the porch for the next several hours. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when Grace wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if Gabriel's fears would prove prophetic. But eventually, as dawn broke over the Texas horizon, she delivered a healthy baby boy, Mrs. Patterson cleaned the infant and placed him in Grace's arms. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's strong features. Grace felt a love so intense it was almost painful. "Gabriel," she called out, her voice hoarse, "come meet your son." The door burst open and Gabriel rushed in, his face wild with worry. When he saw Grace holding the baby, his entire body sagged with relief. "A son?" he asked, approaching slowly as if afraid they might disappear. "A son," Grace confirmed, smiling. "A healthy, perfect son." "Do you want to hold him?" Gabriel reached out with trembling hands and took the baby, cradling him with surprising gentleness for such a large man. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at his son, and Grace saw years of grief and fear begin to transform into something else. Hope, joy, gratitude. "Hello, little one," Gabriel whispered. "I am your father, and I promise I will keep you safe. I promise I will love you every day of my life." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Gabriel looked at her, then back at the baby. "I want to name him after your father." "What was his name?" "Frank," Grace said, feeling her own tears start. "Frank Thomas." "Then this is Frank," Gabriel said. "Frank Jackson. Hello, Frank." The baby yawned and made a small sound, and both parents laughed, giddy with exhaustion and relief and love. Buttercup, who had been kept outside during the labor, somehow pushed through the door and trotted into the bedroom. She approached the bed cautiously, sniffing curiously at the new arrival. Then, as if to welcome Frank to the family, she performed her spinning hop right there in the bedroom, nearly knocking over the washstand in the process. Gabriel laughed, that full, rich laugh Grace had learned to treasure, and even Mrs. Patterson smiled despite her stern demeanor. "That lamb," Grace said, shaking her head. "She never misses an opportunity." "She knows this is important," Gabriel said. "She is celebrating." They settled into their new life as parents with the same mixture of joy and terror that all new parents experience. Gabriel proved to be a devoted father, taking on night duties without complaint, pacing the floor with Frank when the baby would not sleep, singing rough lullabies in his deep voice. Grace watched him with their son and felt her heart swell with love. This was the life she had dreamed of, but never quite believed she would have. A home, a husband who loved her, a child, and yes, even a ridiculous performing lamb who continued to bring laughter into their days. Frank grew quickly, a healthy, happy baby who seemed to find joy in everything. By his first birthday, he was walking and babbling constant streams of nonsense that Gabriel insisted were words. Buttercup appointed herself as the child's guardian, following him everywhere and bleating in alarm whenever he ventured too close to anything potentially dangerous. Grace became pregnant again when Frank was 18 months old, and this time Gabriel managed his anxiety better, though she still caught him watching her with worried eyes whenever he thought she was not looking. Their second child, a daughter they named Faith, was born in the spring of 1881, and the labor was mercifully shorter than with Frank. Faith had Grace's light hair and delicate features, and Gabriel treated her like she was made of spun sugar. Grace had to remind him frequently that their daughter needed to be allowed to explore and play, that keeping her wrapped in protective cotton was not healthy. As the children grew, the small house became cramped, and Gabriel and Henry worked together to add 2 more rooms, expanding the home to accommodate their growing family. Grace planted more gardens, learned to can and preserve food for winter, and discovered she had a talent for making jams that became popular at the market in Dallas. Gabriel took on more responsibility at the ranch, eventually becoming Henry's foreman. His reputation as an honest, hard-working man spread, and he was sought out for advice by neighboring ranchers. The solemn, closed-off man Grace had first met was gone, replaced by someone who smiled easily and laughed often, though he still had his quiet days when old sorrows surfaced. Buttercup lived to the remarkable age of 12, ancient for a sheep. She remained a beloved member of the family, performing her tricks for the children and anyone else who would watch. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1890, the entire family mourned her as deeply as they would a person. Gabriel built a grave marker for her in the yard with a simple inscription that read, "Buttercup, she made us laugh." They planted wildflowers over her grave, and Grace would sometimes find Frank and Faith sitting beside it, telling stories about the lamb who had been part of their family for their entire lives. By the time Frank was 12 and Faith was 10, Grace and Gabriel had added 1 more child to their family. A second daughter named Florence, born in 1885, who had her father's dark coloring and serious demeanor, though she laughed easily enough when her siblings coaxed her into play. Grace sometimes looked back on that day in Dallas when Buttercup had escaped and run toward a solemn cowboy and marveled at how completely her life had changed. She had been so lost then, so scared and uncertain. And now she had this, a home, a family, love that filled every corner of her days. Gabriel, catching her in one of these reflective moods, would pull her close and kiss her forehead. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am," Grace would say. "How lucky we both are." "It was not luck," Gabriel always replied. "It was you and that lamb refusing to let me stay locked away. You saved me, Grace. You and Buttercup gave me my life back." "You saved me too," Grace would remind him. "I was just as lost as you were. Then we saved each other." In 1892, Henry Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. He left the ranch to Gabriel in his will, along with a letter expressing how proud he was of the man Gabriel had become and the family he had built. Gabriel wept when he read the letter, grieving the loss of the man who had given him a chance when he was still deep in his grief, who had been patient and kind, and had become like a father to him. They buried Henry next to his wife on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Gabriel made sure the property was maintained with the same care Henry had shown. He hired more hands, expanded operations, and within a few years had turned the Morrison Ranch into one of the most successful in the county. But success did not change the core of who they were. Grace still tended her gardens and made her jams. Gabriel still took time each day to play with his children, to walk the property, to sit on the porch with Grace in the evenings and talk about their days. They had learned, both of them, that life was precious and fleeting, and they refused to waste a moment of it. Frank grew into a responsible young man who shared his father's talent with horses and his mother's easy way with people. At 19, he began courting a neighboring rancher's daughter, and Gabriel and Grace watched with bittersweet pride as their son prepared to start his own life. Faith developed a talent for drawing and painting, covering pages with images of the ranch, the animals, her family. She talked of perhaps going to art school someday, and though the idea of his daughter leaving terrified Gabriel, he supported her dreams. Florence, their youngest, surprised everyone by showing an interest in medicine. She would doctor injured animals on the ranch, and the local physician who treated them said she had a natural gift for healing. Gabriel made inquiries about medical schools that accepted women, determined that his daughter would have every opportunity to pursue her calling. As Grace approached 40, she sometimes felt the weight of her years, the accumulated losses and joys that had shaped her. Her father had been gone for over 20 years now, and though she still missed him, the grief no longer had the power to overwhelm her. She had built a life he would have been proud of, had raised children who knew they were loved, had found a love she had not even known to hope for. Gabriel, now 45, had silver threading through his dark hair, and lines had deepened around his eyes. But he was still strong, still capable, and more importantly, still wholly present in their life together. The shadow of his first family's loss no longer haunted him as it once had, though Grace knew he carried it still. But it was integrated now, a part of his history rather than his entire identity. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the ranch, their children grown or nearly so, Gabriel took Grace's hand. "You remember the day Buttercup ran into me in Dallas?" he asked. "Of course," Grace said. "How could I forget? You looked like you wanted to shoot both of us." Gabriel laughed. "I did not want to shoot you, I just did not know what to do with you." This woman chasing a lamb through a town that had just seen a gunfight, acting like it was the most normal thing in the world. "It seemed normal to me," Grace said. Everything else was so overwhelming, but getting Buttercup back was something I could control. "You were remarkable," Gabriel said. "You are remarkable, and I never properly thanked you." "Thank me for what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth saving underneath all that anger and grief. For bringing laughter back into my life. For giving me a reason to open my heart again." Grace squeezed his hand. "You gave me just as much. You gave me a home, a family, love. You gave me everything I needed when I needed it most." "We were lucky to find each other," Gabriel said. "We were," Grace agreed. "Although I maintain that Buttercup deserves most of the credit." Gabriel smiled, that beautiful smile that still made Grace's heart skip. "She does. That lamb changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the sounds of the ranch settling for the night around them. In the distance, they could hear their children's voices as Frank, Faith, and Florence worked on evening chores. It was a good life, hard-earned and deeply appreciated. Grace leaned her head on Gabriel's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. This was what she had needed all those years ago when she stumbled into Dallas. Not just safety or security, but this. Someone to build a life with. Someone who understood both joy and sorrow. Someone who would sit with her on a porch and watch the sun set year after year and never grow tired of her company. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Gabriel replied. "Today, tomorrow, always." As 1894 approached, bringing with it new challenges and changes, Grace and Gabriel faced it together, as they had faced everything since that day in Dallas. Their love had started with a solemn cowboy, a determined woman, and a cheerful lamb who knew how to make people laugh. It had grown into something deep and lasting, tested by loss and strengthened by shared joy. Frank married his sweetheart in the spring of 1894, in a ceremony held at the ranch with half the county in attendance. Faith had applied to art schools back east and was waiting to hear about acceptance. Florence had begun apprenticing with the local doctor, her eyes bright with purpose. Grace and Gabriel became grandparents for the first time in 1895 when Frank and his wife had a son. Holding that baby, seeing Gabriel's face as he looked at his grandson, Grace felt the circle complete somehow. They had survived their losses, built something good from grief, and now that legacy would continue into another generation. On their 17th wedding anniversary, Gabriel surprised Grace with a gift, a lamb. It was tiny and white, with the same curious, friendly nature that Buttercup had possessed. "I know we cannot replace Buttercup," Gabriel said as Grace cradled the lamb, "but I thought maybe we could honor her memory." Grace felt tears stream down her face. "She is perfect. What should we name her?" "That is up to you," Gabriel said. Grace thought for a moment, looking at the lamb, then at Gabriel, then at their home and the life they had built together. "Hope," she said finally. "We will call her Hope." Gabriel pulled her close, the lamb between them, and kissed her softly. "Hope," he agreed. "That is perfect." As the sun set over the Texas landscape they had called home for so many years, Grace, Gabriel, and their new lamb stood together. A family forged by loss and laughter, by a solemn cowboy who learned to open his heart, and a woman who refused to give up on finding joy even in the darkest times. It had started with Buttercup making Gabriel laugh, but it had become so much more. A love story written across years, a family built on foundation of mutual understanding and unwavering support, a life well lived and deeply cherished. In the years that followed, as Gabriel's hair turned fully silver and Grace's face gained its own map of lines, they remained as devoted to each other as they had been that first day by the creek when he kissed her and promised to try. They watched their children flourish, their grandchildren grow, and the ranch prosper. They faced hard winters and drought years, celebrations and sorrows, always together, always supporting each other. Faith did go to art school and eventually returned to Texas to open a studio in Dallas, her paintings sought after by collectors throughout the state. Florence became a doctor, one of the first women physicians in Texas, and opened a practice that served both the wealthy ranchers and the struggling farmhands with equal care. Frank took over the ranch operations, running it with the same integrity and skill his father had shown. Gabriel lived to the age of 67, passing away peacefully in the spring of 1900 with Grace holding his hand. His last words were to tell her he loved her and to thank her once again for saving him all those years ago. Grace grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had 56 years of life behind her, 22 of them spent with Gabriel, and she knew how fortunate she had been. She lived another 12 years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, all of whom grew up hearing the story of how their grandmother came to Texas with nothing but determination and a lamb, and how that lamb had made a solemn cowboy laugh, opening his heart to love again. Grace passed away in her sleep in 1912, at the age of 68, in the home she and Gabriel had built together. On her bedside table was a faded photograph of Gabriel holding Buttercup, his face transformed by laughter, and beside it, a newer photograph of their family. Children and grandchildren gathered around Grace and Gabriel on their porch, multiple generations brought together by a love that had started with a woman, a cowboy, and a cheerful lamb who knew exactly when to perform her tricks. The ranch remained in the family for generations, each inheritor hearing the story of its beginning, of Grace and Gabriel and Buttercup, of how love could bloom even in the hardest soil if you were brave enough to tend it, patient enough to wait for it, and willing enough to laugh when a lamb did a silly dance. And in the cemetery behind the ranch, 3 graves sat together under the shade of an oak tree that Gabriel had planted. Gabriel Jackson, beloved husband and father, Grace Thompson Jackson, beloved wife and mother, and between them a small marker for Buttercup, the lamb who made them laugh and in doing so made everything possible. The end.